Well, good evening, everybody, or good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be, and welcome to another of our Harif lockdown lectures. On behalf of Lawrence and myself, we'd like to introduce Harif to those who don't know us. Harif is the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. We are a group of volunteers and we aim to raise awareness of the history and culture of these Jews. Please do sign up to our mailing list if you're not already there. It's simply a matter of going to our website, which is www.harif.org. And we also have a sister site called Point of No Return, and that's a blog which keeps you up to date with the news. This session is being live streamed, hopefully, to the Harif Facebook page, and it'll also be recorded, and there'll be a link on the website. Any questions or comments, you're welcome to type them in the chat, which is the bottom of the button at the bottom of your screen. But please do leave them to the end of the presentation. I'd also like to thank JIMENA, who are our co-hosts tonight. JIMENA is Harif's counterpart in California, and they also raise awareness of Middle East and North African Jews, and they advocate on their behalf. So the topic for tonight is Jews in Kurdistan, past and future. And when I say Kurdistan, I really mean the ancient communities of both Arabic-speaking and Aramaic-speaking Jews in northern Iraq. Some 20,000 Jews left the region in 1950. In fact, the entire community, as far as we know. But is there reason to believe that Jews might return to this part of the world? With us tonight, we are delighted to welcome our two guest speakers. We have Dena Attar in London, who will give us the historical background on the Jews of northern Iraq. And joining us from somewhere in the US is Levi Meir Clancy. Levi is on a road trip at the moment, but he has actually moved to Erbil in Kurdistan, where he owns a home. And I think he is the only Jew that I know of who's actually immigrated to Kurdistan. But first of all, Dr. Dena Attar, I would like to welcome her. Hello, Dena. She is a writer and musician and was formerly a senior lecturer at the Open University. She's also a violinist with the Iraqi Jewish music ensemble Rivers of Babylon. She completed a dissertation on the Mosul Jewish community in 2019 at University College London, drawing on historical research and family records. Her late father, Menashe Attar, was born in Mosul. So over to you, Dena. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to begin. Yeah, there we are. Right, I hope you can all see that.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to begin by introducing you to somebody, and I will explain why I'm introducing you to Warda. Her name was Warda, which means rose in Arabic, and she was the daughter of Eliyahu and Rahel Shoshi. Eliyahu was also known as Makdassi, and she was born probably in 1894, died in Israel in 1964. And you can see a photograph of her taken when she was still in Mosul before she emigrated, and another one, which was when I really got to know her slightly, in Israel, where she eventually died. She had 3 daughters and 6 sons, one of whom was my own father. And there's a reason why I'm introducing you to her to begin with. And that's because when I was thinking about this talk, I was thinking about how to speak about both Mosul, which is really what I've done my own research on, and Kurdistan, about which I don't really know quite as much, although I hope we're going to hear a lot more later on from my fellow speaker. But I thought this is a good starting point because it turns out that she was, in fact, Kurdish as well as Jewish. And I didn't know that until sometime in the 1980s, the late 1980s, when my father told me, when we were talking about the Kurdish community in Mosul, that his own mother was Kurdish. And that had never previously been mentioned, which raised a lot of questions to begin with. But then he went on to tell me that when his parents argued, his father would call his mother the daughter of a Kurdish cobbler. And that raised another question about what the status differences were and how Kurdish Jews and the Jews of Mosul saw each other, the extent to which they interacted, the extent to which there's overlap between these communities. And it turns out to be a really large question and not a particularly easy question to answer either. And it's going to come up throughout this talk. So I'm going to start with just a little introduction to the area. Like I said, this is not really my main area of expertise, but we need to think first of all about where Kurdistan is, and it's the more shaded area, which is the mountainous region, and Mosul is really right on the edge of it. So Kurdistan itself consists of a number of villages and towns. Mosul is the largest city in the area as far as Iraq is concerned, and by a considerable margin. And it's now a very large city indeed. It's Iraq's second city. But it wasn't always part of Iraq, of course. And we need to think about what this means in terms of the relationship of the Jews of Mosul and the Jews of Iraq as a whole, because it was quite a while before they did consider themselves to be part of the Iraqi Jewish community. It didn't really happen until the whole question of whether Mosul did or didn't belong to the rest of Iraq was settled, and that didn't happen until 1925. So why is Mosul so different, and what do the Kurds and the Jews of Mosul have in common? Well, one of the first things is not really being Arab in the ways in which other members of the Iraqi communities might have thought of themselves. Some did, some didn't, obviously. And in 1924 to 25, there was what was called the Mosul question to try and settle this whole business of whether Mosul and the area around Mosul did or didn't belong to the future country of Iraq. The emissaries from the League of Nations, who had a commission set up to find the answer to this question, travelled all around the region and talked to a lot of so-called community leaders and representatives and find out what they thought. And they found that most people didn't want to go back to being ruled from Turkey. They'd had a terrible experience during the First World War and when they were an Ottoman province as part of the Ottoman Empire. So there were a lot of fears about that. Turkey had insisted on this prolonged debate and discussion. Otherwise, there could have just been continued war after the First World War. It didn't particularly end as far as this region was concerned in 1918. But there were also fears about Arab nationalism. And that came up quite strongly from many of the minorities in the region. There are a lot of Christian minorities as well as the majority Muslim population, and there are the Yazidis as well as, and some other much smaller groups. So generally, the Jews in the Mosul area were caught. They did not want to lose their links to Baghdad that were very important to them, but they were also nervous about the future. And this was also, for some time, a war zone in the sense that there were a lot of Kurdish uprisings against the British mandatory rule, and the British were bombing Turkish areas. So it was very unsettled, Kurdish areas. So it was very unsettled for quite a while. And this is another way of looking at the region. It's a difficult map to really look at. Mosul's marked out in red, but you can see a lot of little scattered places on this map, and it shows the journeys that Rabbi David went on in around about 200 years ago now, 1824 or thereabouts. And he wrote about his contacts and his visits with all these scattered Kurdish communities. And you can see just how scattered they are. Of course, they're not all in what is now Iraq. Some were in Turkey, somewhere in what was then called Persia, as well as what on this map is known as Mesopotamia. And he visited very many of them. And one of the things he was very interested in was the languages they spoke. And he talked about how they spoke a language, he simply calls it Aramaic. It's nowadays known as Neo-Aramaic. And there are several dialects of it. There's at least 2 dialects of Neo-Aramaic. And that was one of the reasons why he felt certain that what they said about themselves was probably true, which was that they were the descendants of the Assyrian exile, not the Babylonian exile, but the Assyrian exile, which is considerably older than the Babylonian exile. And so they thought of themselves as a very, very ancient Jewish community. And he saw no reason to doubt that. Many other historians have also taken a similar line and said they're a very, very old community. And Walter Fischel, who actually published the original writings of Rabbi David in 1944, himself wrote that how and when they came there is a mystery. They're among the least known and least explored of all the remnants of Israel. But it's not just the Jews of Kurdistan that consider themselves to be descendants of the Assyrian exile and not the Babylonian exile. That's also what the Mosul Jewish community have said about themselves. We can't either prove it or disprove it, given our present state of knowledge, but there is evidence of various kinds of certainly extremely ancient Jewish settlements. The linguistic evidence is something that does make you think possibly there has been continuous settlement for a very, very long time. The fact that Aramaic was still being spoken. There are also some very ancient sites, but it's really something we probably are never going to really know for certain, because we don't really know a lot about how people came to be there much more than 1,000 years ago. We do know quite a few things about some of the earliest buildings in Mosul, and this is a map of Old Mosul. This map dates back to the 18th century, and it was drawn up by one of the British explorers who went there. You can see on the west side of the River Tigris, there's the old city of Mosul. And you can also see on the east side 2 large areas that are marked out. The larger one of those is the site of Nineveh, which was the Assyrian capital that eventually got destroyed. And it's possible that the earliest settlement started out as a village near there. We know that the settlement that turned into some kind of Jewish quarter has been there for since before the Islamic conquest, because there was a place name that's been recorded, Hesna Ebrea, which translates as the Hebrew castle. And that name continued to be used as late as the 13th century. So that suggests there was an extremely old Jewish settlement in what eventually became Mosul. You can also see in the smaller areas marked out on the east side of the river, Neve Yunus, that's the shrine of the prophet Jonah. That was in fact a Muslim shrine, not a Jewish pilgrimage site. And it turns out that it was built on top of much, much older buildings. They seem to have included a church and Assyrian temple remains. And that's one of the buildings that was damaged and destroyed when ISIS occupied the area. The modern city of Mosul doesn't look like this at all, of course. It expanded greatly to the east, and when the British were occupying after the end of the First World War, they began to build more permanent bridges. Originally, there was just what was called the Bridge of Boats across the river. In Mosul, by the way, there were originally, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were probably 5 synagogues, one of which was extremely old. You had to go down steps to get to it, and it was mostly underground. This is probably not that very old synagogue, but it's one of the synagogues that was discovered when US troops were in Mosul at the time of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And the army chaplain identified Hebrew inscriptions, which got him to understand that this was in fact the site of an old synagogue. It had been used as a rubbish dump. And since then, unfortunately, there are other synagogues like this one, which have also been discovered as complete ruins. ISIS did a tremendous amount of damage to churches. And I don't know if you noticed in the news very recently, the Pope was visiting Mosul, and he was specifically visiting the sites of churches which had been damaged or destroyed by ISIS. But the Islamists didn't recognize or identify any Jewish sites, so they didn't especially target them to be destroyed, although in fact they were all pretty derelict anyway and were being used for other purposes if they were still standing. This is the site of one of the largest synagogues in Mosul, which was once described as being absolutely magnificent, with columns down the middle and several aisles and so on, and you know, all their famous rabbis used to preach there for hours, and it is now a ruin. There is a historian of Mosul who writes the blog Mosul Eye, Omar Mohammed, who is writing currently about possibly renovating these old synagogues and possibly trying to revive something of the history of the Jews in Mosul and get more people interested in it. He's done some fantastic work. He's recently set up international meetings, bringing together survivors from the Jewish community of Mosul. He is doing wonderful work, and I can't recommend his blog enough, really, if you come across it. It's called Mosul Eye. He was in Mosul himself until he managed to escape when it was occupied by ISIS, and was sending out information about what was going on there. So more about Mosul's past and the past of the region as a whole. This is a very recent picture. It's, as you can see, it's not a photograph at all. It's from a children's book that's just out. And it's a book about a woman called Asnas, or Osnat, or Asnat, probably with a surname something like Barazani, who became the head of a Mosul yeshiva. In the 16th century, I think it was the male members of her family having died, she was able to take it over, but she seems to have been a very learned woman herself. And there are quite a number of stories about her. So this is a children's book that's recently been brought out, telling the story of this particular woman. And it's one of the pieces of evidence that we have, these stories about Asnath, of the amount of religious and literary activity that there was in the Mosul area, because the information we have from centuries ago is very, very scattered, and it has to be pieced together. There are things like fragments that are in the Cairo Geniza that have been found, and mentions of Mosul in various other places, but we don't at the moment have a really full history of the community in lots of different respects. So how do we try to separate out, if we want to, and distinguish the Jews of Mosul and Kurdish Jews as a whole? It's not easy. There was an author, Grauer, who published the research that Raphael Patai had done into the Kurdish Jewish communities. He wrote about Mosul as a city of border zones, and at the same time centrally situated, that is both industrial and spiritual centre to the Kurdish Jews, which suggests that Mosul was always important as far as Kurdish Jews were concerned. To what extent does it work the other way around? And to what extent do we treat them as separate groups? It's true that rural Kurdish Jews were and still are very distinctive in a number of ways. There are differences between the ways in which they're written about and the ways in which the Jews of Mosul have been written about. And that partly is, I think, a question of attitude and approach, and something that we probably should be questioning. So when you read anything about the Jews of Kurdistan, it tends to be more folkloric. There's a lot of interest in them having these sort of linguistic oddities, still speaking Aramaic. People have taken a very ethnographic approach towards them, and sometimes even genetic, because they're considered to be such an isolated community, and a community that's been isolated for such a long time that they are distinctly separate. So you can look at, whether they've got any inherited characteristics, for example. And there's quite an amount of literature, particularly published by medical scientists in Israel after they emigrated there, which looks at them from that point of view, which is not something that's done about the Jews of Mosul. So you can ask the question of whether this is something that tells us more about attitudes towards them as a group than it does about the Jews of Kurdistan themselves. Now, sometimes in terms of the politics of the area, the Jews of Mosul and Kurdish Jews get considered together, and at other times they don't. And that's also in terms of political regions, political representation, and so on. When you look at the statistics, sometimes the population data is separated out, but not always. And you can trace a lot of connections that go in both directions. For example, I think the password for tonight's meeting was Barazani, which was also the surname of many of the most famous Mosul, rabbis in Mosul, including the chief rabbi in the 20th century. Arbili is another surname that crops up, and Shoshana Arbili, who's one of the most famous people from Mosul that emigrated to Israel, was a member of the Knesset eventually, and her surname Arbili suggests that her family came from Arbil, of course. So there are a lot of indications and a lot of stories too that are told about interactions and travel that go in both directions. So it's not so easy to say definitively there are the Kurdish Jews and there are the Jews of Mosul and they're different. But in some respects, obviously people looked at them as different, and in some respects they were. They do have in common this claim that they're descended from the Assyrian exiles, and also that they have this tremendous pride in their heritage and their history, which they consider to be a longer history than the history of the Babylonian community. So looking at the population statistics, just to give us an idea of what a sizable community we're thinking about, the estimated Iraqi Jewish population in 1919, when the British occupation authorities carried out a census, which is probably the first census that's taken completely seriously. They considered that Jews in Iraq were not much more than 3% of the total population. But of course, it was very much higher in Baghdad. In 1919, that was not really true in the Mosul and Kurdish area at all. And Mosul was considered to be half Arab, half Kurdish. At the same time, about a quarter of the population of Mosul was thought to be Christian. And Jews, on the other hand, were only around 3 to 5% of the Mosul population. So they're a pretty small minority, considerably smaller than the Christian minority. In Kurdistan, they thought there were about a population of around about 14,000. And, no, wait a minute, is this the same? Yes, no, this is the same date. This is still 1919, yeah. So the population is concentrated, of Jews is really concentrated in Baghdad at this time, where they're about a fifth of the total population. Some people put it as high as a third, actually, in Baghdad at that time. By the late 1940s, the population's gone up everywhere, but Jews in Mosul are still significantly a minority. And at the time of the emigration, there were probably a community of about 8,000, 7 to 8,000 or thereabouts. Some of these census statistics are a little bit questionable because you couldn't do a head count very easily. Sometimes it's an estimate of the number of people in a household. Sometimes only certain people in the household would be counted. But it's thought around 8,000 Jews left Mosul in 1950 to 51. And as Lynn said earlier, the total's around about 20,000, so about 12,000 left Kurdistan. So going back to this idea of what are the differences and what are the characteristics, some of it, this is genuine characteristics, but some of this is really assumptions or even stereotypes. So what's absolutely definite is the Jews of Mosul are an urban community. Mosul is a city and has been for a very long time. The Jews of Kurdistan are rural in many respects, but at the same time, there were a number of towns in Kurdistan, such as Zakho and Dahuk and Erbil, and there were some quite large population centres, relatively large as far as the Jews are concerned in Kurdistan. So some of them are semi-urban as well. The Jews of Mosul began to have schools a lot later than the Jews of Baghdad. And really, they're about a generation behind, in fact. And the Alliance was setting up schools in the last quarter or so of the 19th century. The Jews of Mosul didn't begin to get schools until not long before the First World War. And then the Ottoman authorities closed all schools during the First World War. So many girls had no opportunity to go to school until quite a lot later. And boys had rather more opportunities. But by the time the Jews emigrated, still you've got an older generation who had had very little education. My own grandparents didn't have a chance to be literate, for example. And in Kurdistan, Jews had even less access to schooling, so were less likely to be literate. This didn't mean it was always the case. I mean, there certainly is evidence of the Jews having their own literature in Kurdistan, going back quite a long way. But we can assume that this made a considerable difference to people's lives and people's opportunities. So the Jews of Mosul were more likely to be literate and educated. And they were religious in the same way that the Jews of Kurdistan were religious, but they're considered to be more religious in a sort of provincial way. Yes, you can't be as secular in a town like Mosul in the first half of the century as you could in the much bigger city of Baghdad, where you get people talking and remembering about their lives as being not specifically as religious and as religiously constrained as the Jews of Mosul. When the Jews of Kurdistan are studied, though, you often find that they are spoken of and written about as if their take on religion is a lot more superstitious. There's even talk of when they emigrated, this is out of some kind of messianic fervour. And it's hard to know how much of this is a really objective description and how much of it is just an imposed idea of difference, an imposed idea of how people who come from rural communities are particularly thought about in relation to people from urban and supposedly more sophisticated communities. And some of this, I think, doesn't particularly hold up. The language difference is clear. The Jews of Mosul spoke Arabic. They spoke their own Mosul dialect of Arabic. And so sometimes there is definitely a language difference, and that comes up in some of the later stories. The occupations, now there's a lot of overlap. Shoemaking is a very common occupation in the first half of the 20th century and earlier, and leatherwork and metalwork and so on. Commerce on both sides, acting as merchants. The merchants of Mosul were much more engaged with the region and locally, and even across to Syria and Arabia and so on. But it's not the same kind of international trade and commerce that the merchants of Baghdad would have had, because they had much better access to the British Empire via India and also contacts in China as well as Bombay. Whereas the Kurdish Jews who were merchants were traveling merchants around villages and towns in the region. It's a different type of occupation. So there are some real differences, but there are also some overlaps, and also there's a lot of interchange. So in the First World War, for example, when the Ottoman Empire was calling up men from all these different communities. Previously, they'd been allowed exemption from conscription, but during the First World War, that was put aside and everybody was being called up. But a lot of Christians and Jews, as well as a lot of other people, didn't particularly want to go and fight and die for the Ottoman Empire. So many of them went on the run. And that meant Jews of Mosul would go out to the villages of Kurdistan and basically hide out there, come back to Mosul to bring food for their families, maybe learn a trade and practice a trade and travel around in the villages. And there was that kind of interchange that kept people safe and in hiding and able to survive the war. My own grandfather was one of those people who had to go on the run and hide out and then come back with food for his family, but he was certainly not alone. So this is an example in this little image here of a silver amulet from Kurdistan, and I think it's a kind of emblem of the ways in which a lot of people have thought about and written about Kurdish Jews, because it's an example of craftsmanship. It's an example of what might be thought of as a superstitious take on religion, but it's not unique to Kurdistan by any means. And Jews in Mosul would have used amulets, so would Jews in many other communities, and there were metal workers in a lot of other communities, but it's the kind of thing that is thought of as somewhat typical of Kurdish Jews. And this idea that you need something to keep you, for women to keep them safe in childbirth is certainly very common in many communities of the time. So we've got a kind of conclusion that rural Kurdish Jews were and are distinctive in many ways, but the studies tend to focus on particular things about them. Politically, they're sometimes considered together with the Jews of Mosul, not always. And there are multiple identifiable connections, multiple stories of interaction and travel in both directions. We've got a photograph here from 1930, which gives us, some more of these clues about interactions. This is a photograph taken because there were important visitors from Israel, and you can see them sitting right in the middle of the front row. These are the emissaries that have come from Jerusalem, presumably to raise money, because that was something that would have happened quite often, that they would travel to other communities seeking funds. But you can tell when you looked at the list of names that, as well as these dignitaries who are given the label of leaders of the Jewish community of Mosul, there are actually a couple of visitors there as well. And these are men from Dahuk, whose names aren't given, because they're not permanent members of the community, they're just visitors. They're standing on the left, right at the back 2 rows. And if you look carefully, you can see they're dressed slightly differently. At this time in 1930, you can see everybody's wearing somewhat traditional dress. Nobody's made the shift to wearing modern westernized clothing at this point. But you can still see many of the dignitaries wearing the kind of hats they would have worn under the Ottoman Empire. And the emissaries from Dahuk seem to be, the visitors from Dahuk seem to be dressed rather differently. And you can also see, if you look at the names, that there's also a Baruch Zahawi, who possibly has come from Zaho, which is another indication of names of people in Mosul that tell you they've actually come from other parts of Kurdistan. This is another point of interaction. It's a tomb of Nahum, which is still in existence. It's not been destroyed, although it's not in a very good state. And it's in the village of Al-Kosh, which was a Christian Kurdish village some miles out from Mosul. And it's where the Jews of both Mosul and Kurdistan used to go on pilgrimage, usually at Shavuot, and it was their traditional annual pilgrimage site. It was actually bordered, the route between Mosul and Al-Kosh was actually bordered by Kurdish Christian villages in the main. So those were the people that were guarding the route and in charge of the route, which meant that there were times when it was dangerous. There's a story about how Jewish pilgrims were attacked and robbed on the way. And then the MP, who was the MP for the Jews of the Mosul area, had to step in and try and get the local authorities to take some action against the bandits, because this was a really serious attack that should not have happened. And they did manage to round up the culprits, but then there was just an outcry from the neighbouring villages. They had to let the men go again. And what happened then was that Sasson Semach, that was the name of the MP, had to use his contacts and his relationship with the other religious leaders of the area, the sort of Christian patriarchs and so on, to try and get some justice for the victims of this attack. Because it couldn't go unpunished, it was too serious, but at the same time, the men couldn't be caught and put in prison because that would have created too much trouble in the region. So it had to be dealt with by the Christian patriarch just using his authority to speak to his flock and basically give them a big telling off. And I think that tells you something about the precarious nature of the relationships between the communities and the sorts of responsibilities they felt towards each other, the sort of difficult balancing act everybody was having to have to ensure as much as possible peaceful coexistence, even though it wasn't always peaceful. And that peaceful coexistence was really made much, much more difficult by Iraqi independence and from the 1930s onwards, when things really started to change a lot. And this is a photograph of Iraq Independence Day in Mosul. And it's in the 1930s in particular that things got really very dangerous for the Jews in both Mosul and certain areas of Kurdistan. It came and went. It wasn't always as dangerous, but there are particular events and crisis points. So for one of them, for instance, was the massacre of unarmed Assyrian Christians at a site not very far from Mosul. That was one of the first actions of the newly independent Iraqi army. The Assyrians, they were called Assyrians, were a group of Christians who had actually come from the other side of the border at the end of the First World War, and they had ended up fighting on the British side of the war, and so they were armed, they were levied, they were given arms to fight. They had to leave their original area and couldn't go back there because it was now the other side of a national boundary. They couldn't return to the villages they'd come from, so they were homeless and they were kind of wandering around really for years. And the Iraqi authorities and many of the Kurdish districts just thought them as troublemakers, basically. They didn't know what to do with them. Their various solutions were suggested and none of them worked out. And in the end, they were just basically rounded up, taken somewhere, disarmed, and then the Iraqi army massacred these unarmed people. And they proclaimed it as a great victory. And that was absolutely chilling for all the other minorities in the area who thought, well, who's going to be next then? It put everybody on guard and made everybody extremely nervous. So that was one of the events in the 1930s, which I think had a very profound effect on people in the area. Another thing that happened in the 1930s was the murder of the British consul. That happened after the King of Iraq had been killed in a road accident, which some conspiracy theorists at the time claimed was actually a British assassination. It wasn't. He just liked driving fast cars and was going too fast. But this rumour went around very fast. And then the Jews were targeted in Mosul because they were considered to be in some way responsible as proxies of the British or something. So there was an attempt to march on the the Jewish quarter in Mosul. The Jews at that time mostly lived in the old Jewish quarter. And this happened at a time when the Jews were out. It was a festival day. They got wind of it and they were told to go home and lock their doors and stay indoors quick. And then the mob actually was redirected to go and attack the British consul, which they did, and they managed to get hold of the British consul and murdered him. And that was kind of considered to be a sort of providential rescue as far as the Jews were concerned in Mosul, but obviously another extremely disturbing event.
Sorry, Dena, to interrupt, but can we just speed up a little bit?
Yeah, I'm not got much further to go. events of the Second World War. I think anyone who knows anything about the Jews of Baghdad will know what happened in 1941 with the Farhud. There were not events on the same scale in Mosul or Kurdistan, but there certainly were a number of attacks and a number of prospective attacks that managed to be averted. And the Jews of Kurdistan had often been under the protection of a local Kurdish leader. This was considered to be quite an ancient feudal system, and it was obviously sort of slightly double-edged, because if it worked, you were protected, but if it didn't work, you weren't, and it was very provisional. So there's this very chilling quotation in Mordechai Zaken's work on the Jews of Kurdistan, when this local tribal chief was quoted as having said, "If there was a government decree to kill the Jews, I'm the one who'd do it, for they are my Jews. Why did you send your men against them?" That was when a different Kurdish chieftain's men had been threatening the Jews of a particular area. And that's the village of Sandur, which is the one wholly Jewish village. So there was something of a crisis in the area in 1941, nothing like on the scale of the Farhud, but Jews were threatened, they were menaced, there were attempts to extort large sums of money from them, which they couldn't possibly come up with. And they would hide themselves away until they thought the crisis was over. Many Jews from Kurdistan began emigrating well before that, and the reasons were sometimes economic, sometimes general insecurity, because there were a number of murders when they were traveling between villages and towns, and that meant their whole livelihoods as well as their lives were being threatened. And the final emigration was something that involved the Mosul community to a considerable extent, because many of the Kurdish Jews had to travel through Mosul. And Ezra Laniado, in his book about the Jews of Mosul, has told a number of stories about how the Kurdish Jews ended up in Mosul, many of them without funds. They ran out of money very quickly. They ran out of food. The local community in Mosul had to raise money to feed them, bought them wheat and clothing and blankets and so on. And they were put up in school halls and classrooms, and they built their fires inside these rooms and cooked there and had to sleep there and lived there for months before they were finally able to emigrate. And they were amongst the very last convoys leaving Mosul and eventually on their way to Baghdad and from there to Israel. So they were stuck in Mosul for a very long time, supported by the Jews of Mosul. And I think this is a kind of, the way that Laniado writes about it, and on the one hand, it's a good indication of this relationship between the communities, but also he writes about it from the point of view of someone very urban who's absolutely shocked to see the way that the Jews of Kurdistan lived and the way they sort of built fires, cooked their food over and so on. And so it's a kind of meeting of the two communities, which tells us something about what they did and didn't know about each other, and the extent to which they were kind of mutually aligned and their lives were woven together. I think the thing I'm going to end with, really, because I know that a lot of sad stories inevitably come up, and a lot of stories of danger and so on, but the tremendous pride in their heritage comes out when you read anything about their history and when you read any of the memoirs. But I would say also that what you don't get from them is what you sometimes get from the memoirs of the Jews of Baghdad. You don't get them saying, it was paradise. You don't get them sort of looking back nostalgically to a life that was kind of wonderful, and because actually it was a very hard life. And I think that's something that they were extremely aware of. I think I should end it there.
Well, thank you so much, Dena. That was a wonderful summary, and thank you for weaving together the history of both the Mosul Jews and the Jews in the Kurdish mountains. Because you ended in 1950, and Levi is going to talk about contemporary politics, if you like, I thought I would just fill in the gap a little bit. And just say that in the 1960s, the Kurdish Peshmerga fighters were rebelling against the regime in Baghdad. And Israel then cemented good relations with the Kurds when it sent arms and advisors to train them. When a ceasefire was declared in 1970, it became possible for 2,000 Jews trapped in Iraq to be smuggled over the border into Iran with the help of the Kurds. And we have several on the call tonight who took this very route. During the Iraq-Iran war, Iran supported the Kurds against Iraq. A notorious episode was the gassing of up to 7,000 Kurds at Halabja. After the fall of Saddam Hussein, the Kurds set up their own autonomous regional government. In 2017, they held a referendum on whether to declare independence. An overwhelming majority voted yes. The only state to recognize an independent Kurdistan was Israel. So to bring us up to date, we're delighted to have with us Levi Meir Clancy. Welcome, Levi. Now, Levi lives in Erbil, the capital of the autonomous Kurdistan region in Iraq, and he's the founder of Foundation of Ours, which supports Jewish expression in the Kurdistan region. He was born in California and moved to the KRI in 2014, after which he became involved in cultural, social, and religious affairs, in addition to his work as a software developer, photographer, and videographer. So over to you, Levi.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the warm introduction. And I was fascinated. Thank you so much for the opportunity to hear Dena, of course, speak. There's a few different dimensions which I could maybe bring today. One of them might be my personal experience living in the Kurdistan region. One of them may be more of my professional experience working with the government in the Kurdistan region and local channels. But the primary thing I want to bring today is actually as a volunteer for the National Association of Jews from Kurdistan. And it's a position which is kind of strange. You know, I'm not Kurdish, I'm American. I immigrated, if you will, to the Kurdistan region, but I think that strangeness actually has given me a lot of privilege. You know, most Kurdish Jews cannot travel freely between Israel and the Kurdistan region, and most Kurdish Muslims can't either. But as an American living there, I have been able to. And also a lot of the Kurdish Jewish community is very regulated on how they might travel. But for myself, coming from the American milieu for all of its secular shortcomings, I was able to feel quite comfortable buying a home in Erbil and then constructing a life from there. So I want to just send a link. I'll send a few links as I go on because I don't want to dive into my own personal backstory very much. But I have here, I just put in the chat, a love letter to the Kurdistan region from an American immigrant. Has a lot of photos, which I hope people enjoy, and it gives a bit more backstory for myself personally. I also want to note I'm incredibly nervous. So if you have any questions in the chat, or if you have any thoughts or ideas, I'm more than happy to respond almost in real time. So I'm not sure what is the baseline of information that people might have about the Kurdistan region. To really introduce it, I want to define first Kurdistan as, of course, an area where there are Kurdish majorities. So, for example, that could include some areas even in the Caucasus, but primarily it would be in southeast Turkey, northeast Syria, the north of Iraq, and the northwest of Iran. So when you look at this whole area of Kurdish existence, you see a lot of oppression. And it's really only in Iraq where you have a constitutionally, legally defined Kurdistan region. So when I talk about Kurdistan, the Kurdistan region, I'm going to be focusing on this area this evening on London time. So the Kurdistan region, a lot of people don't realize that it is actually part of Iraqi law. There is a legal definition. And it, I just saw a question, do I feel safe? Absolutely, absolutely. I'm gonna get to that a little bit later, some more personal anecdotes also, and sort of a life lived in the Kurdistan region. So the Kurdistan region is a very durable, has a very durable existence, a very durable presence. You might see a lot of repression of Kurdishness the illegalization of being able to even speak Kurdish in public or to teach in Kurdish in other countries. But in Iraq, in the Kurdistan region specifically, you have autonomy, it's legal, there's international relations, and you see a strong affirmation of Kurdishness. So when I say it's a semi-autonomous region, I do mean that Iraq controls the airspace, Iraq controls certain other features. The Kurdistan region gets its budget from the federal Iraqi government, which is oftentimes abused, unfortunately, by the government in Baghdad. So it's semi-autonomous. But when you go into it, you feel like you're in a different world, honestly. There is a different entry system. There are visas on arrival for several dozen countries, including the UK and the US, among others. Israel is not on that list. So Israel's without second passports would need to apply for a visa for the Kurdistan region. Or you can go on a second passport, either go for a second passport or apply for a visa. It has its own security forces. The Kurdistan region also has its own government, its own legislative branch. You might have heard news about the Kurdistan region parliament, for example. There's a prime minister, of course, a president also. And what makes this kind of remarkable is that there's a continuous stretch from the Atlantic all the way to the Zagros of exclusively Arab states that define in their constitution, like the first article, that they are an exclusively Arab nation. And Israel and the Kurdistan region are the really only two exceptions to this. So there are, of course, elections in the Kurdistan region. It's a very interesting thing because you'll see, to the outside world, it seems very homogenous, but inside of Kurdistan, you have a wonderful diversity of political thought. You have some parties that are really more political on their premise, some more progressive, some are more traditional. You also have some ethno-religious parties. So, for example, there's parties that are more about like Assyrian issues or other minority issues. There's also a Turkmani party, for example. Okay, I'm just gonna take a quick look. Do I feel safe? I responded to that, absolutely. In fact, there's, I would say, more safety in the Kurdistan region than a lot of other places. You may notice that I'm bundled up in a very discreet way, almost like a ninja, because I'm on a road trip and we had to stop in Vega, Texas. And I prefer to dress very discreetly when I'm in places I'm not familiar with. But in the Kurdistan region, I've never felt unsafe on account of.
Can I ask you a question? Can I ask you a question, Levi? And that's, a few years ago, we heard about the Kurdish Jewish Directorate. And there was a gentleman called Mamsani, I think, who was the head of it. Can you tell us a bit more about this man, given that the Jews of Kurdistan were supposed to have all left in 1950? How come there was a Jewish Directorate?
Okay, so that's a very good question. And because it's a very bitter and actually kind of shocking story, I have it set for to talk in kind of two items, if you will.
Oh,
so after, oh no, it's wonderful. I'm glad that you asked, thank you. Because I'm sure a lot of people have questions about it and I want to make clear, like, absolutely, that's going to come up. So I introduced some basic features of Kurdistan region, its existence, its premise. And I next want to talk about the challenges very briefly. When you think about Jewish life in an Islamic society, people may assume, oh, there's religious issues, there are these other problems, and honestly, it's purely political. There's nothing in Islam that dictates that there had to be an ethnic cleansing of Jews from Arab states, the Kurdistan region, and so forth. I mean, there was no really religious basis on it, and so I hope that things will improve. And I want to make it clear that, there's no obstacle that hopefully will not be surmounted in terms of restoring connection. So the next thing I want to do is, I called it what to watch out for, what to watch for. So positive things to watch for. And then after this, I'm going to talk about what to watch out for, which is kind of the challenging aspect of the problems with, for example, Mamsani. So what to watch for? There are improvements being done to Jewish heritage sites. So the main one, which was mentioned, is the Shrine of the Prophet Nahum. And it's in Al-Kosh. It's a wonderful Assyrian town. And the Shrine of the Prophet Nahum is being renovated with funding by the US Consulate and private donors by an organization called ARCH. And it's being done with involvement from the National Association of Jews from Kurdistan. So the National Association of Jews from Kurdistan is this parastatal official organization in Israel devoted to Kurdishness, to Kurdish Jewishness. And it's incredible that they've been able to be involved. There's also a renovation that's a beginning in a village called Shush of a Jewish heritage site, and National Association being involved there. And there are some other scattered places really in ruins. There's not very much tangible heritage trying to the Prophet Nahum, and hopefully the site in Shush, which is being put on the map by the renovation itself. It otherwise might not be a very consequential site. Another thing to watch for, aside from the improvements to heritage sites, is the communication between leaderships. So there are growing connections between the Kurdistan region and the Kurdish Jewish leadership. I was very overjoyed that for the first time in many years, there have now been calls going on between the endowment of the Ministry of Endowments and Religious Affairs in Kurdistan and the leadership of the Kurdish Jews in Jerusalem. So you see more and more communication at a very top level. There are also growing academic contacts. There have been some presentations by Israeli academics, not necessarily Kurdish, but some academics in Israel. They've done some presentations in the Kurdistan region, and hopefully in the future there'll be a bit more cross-pollination. It's a very safe area for growth. Related to that, there are a lot of problems with what materials are available in the Kurdistan region. You're more likely to find Nazi-themed literature than anything dignified and respectable about Jews if you go to bookstores. So hopefully in the area of academic context, there'll be an improvement to that. All right, I want to take a quick look. What is the level of Iranian influence? To be honest, I wouldn't say on the ground, not very substantial. You have to keep in mind that the Kurdistan region is very small, and the US has the largest consulate in the world being built there. So there is influence, there's porosity with Iran and Syria and Turkey and Baghdad, obviously, but it's not characterized as either one of those exclusively or even mostly. Let's see about Edwin Shukr. Jews having difficulties traveling out of the country. When I say traveling is difficult, I mean that if someone has an Israeli passport and they don't have a second passport and they are Kurdish Jew, it's very hard for them to visit Kurdistan, the Kurdistan region. Well, it's very easy for me as an American. So I try to leverage that privilege. How religiously conservative is society as a whole? I would say very conservative, but very dynamic. Let's see. Yeah. And does Libby feel safe traveling around Iraq? Federal Iraq? No. Let's see, what to watch out for. I feel safe traveling around Kurdistan region, but not federal Iraq. So what to watch out for. Does anybody have any more questions about what to watch for? Kind of the positive things that have been underway?
Just to say that Edwin Shukr is on the call, or was on the call. I hope you're still there, Edwin. And he is actually one of the few people who actually has been to Kurdistan, in fact makes frequent visits there. So perhaps he might like to have a little word, say a few words to us a bit later when you've finished. Yeah, no, over to you. Can't hear you. Uh-oh, you're muted. You're muted. How come?
I don't know, darling. I think that he must have muted himself because I haven't touched the mute button.
Can you just check that you're...
Oh, I'm unmuting him. He muted
okay,
himself.
Right.
Okay, perfect.
Yes,
I'm back now.
we can hear.
So the main things to watch out for, there was a sort of crisis in the last few years. There was a group of men with like very much the same names kept appearing again and again and again, like Sherzad and some others. And they had launched a magazine about Israel and Kurdistan relations. And there's a lot to talk about related to this. So I don't want to go into it too much because it's very, very detailed, but I'm going to send a link about sort of how in a society where there were no Jews left, a community of people was able to essentially do like a charity scam, you might say. So you might see some names like Sherzad or Ranjdar or a few others in particular, Sherko, for example. And these are men who started promoting themselves as Jews, and they were saying that they have a right to, an exclusive right to be responsible for different places.
The only two people I've meeting is Levi and you, and it's not you, darling.
Okay.
Levi, are you still there?
Yeah, I think you've frozen there. Hello?
Should we bring Edwin in while we're waiting for him to come back? Edwin, are you with us?
I am with you.
Yeah.
I mean,
For a second.
Painful because you started to see prophetic figures who were trying to
No, sorry,
essentially run a charity.
Levi. Just ask Edwin just to say a few words. Sorry, you were frozen just then. So.
Oh yeah.
No. It's Levi's evening. I let him finish, and I will just say hello afterwards.
Okay then. All right. Back to you, Levi.
Okay. Oh, I see a question. Can I speak Kurdish? I can speak intermediate Kurdish. And is the car in my office? No, thankfully, no. I do have a home in Erbil, but I'm on a road trip right now, and it didn't quite work out to make it to a perfect stationary location. So I do deeply apologize for less than glamorous.
No, it's really original. Put it that way. Sorry, this is Amazon in the background. Oh, wow. No, just carry on. Sorry about this.
So the things what to watch out for, there was the issue with these damages that were being done, but it was also in some ways a blessing, because when things started to get really bad, and for the first time I started to realize I was really not safe any longer with relation to a few specific activities being done. It also at the same time happened that the Kurdistan region, they reached out, they wanted help talking to, for example, the Kurdish Jewish leadership in Jerusalem. So that was fantastic. One thing that has really happened, and I've seen this, a lot, sometimes you'll see stuff on social media about a lot of solidarity and between people in Israel and people in the Kurdistan region, and it's fantastic. I think that's wonderful. But we have to ultimately focus on improvements for Kurdish Jews. We cannot put that off into the distance. We have to really look at what are the obstacles. So I mentioned, for example, visas are an obstacle. Even simple things like being able to have voices heard in the Kurdistan region is very challenging. Mm-hmm. So does anybody have any questions before I go on to just a few notes about life in the Kurdistan region?
Can you say something quickly about relations between the Assyrians and the Kurds?
Yes. So, anytime that I'm going to talk about it from two angles. The Kurdish people are a minority, obviously, in the Middle East, and the idea of Kurdish autonomy is very much a moral cause. But within the Kurdistan region, Kurds are, of course, a majority. And with that, you have sometimes internal tensions, but also wonderful progress. So under Saddam Hussein, for example, you could never teach in the language of the Assyrians, the Aramaic, as it's known, as they would say in their language, the Sudah. And they couldn't learn. There were no schools teaching in this language. But now in the Kurdistan region, there are. But there are other questions about what role the Kurdistan region has in ministering areas of Assyrian majorities, and how to build a more inclusive future. So I hope that answers it. I don't want to dwell on one particular thing too much, but things are better, but they still have a ways to go. And I mean that actually as a positive thing, because I do strongly believe that things are improving, and there's nothing inherently bad, thankfully. There's a lot of progress. I want to check the questions. Any Jews want to come back to Kurdistan from Israel? Personally, I really haven't met anybody who wanted to permanently relocate. And I think that ties into a few things. For a lot of Kurdish Jews I met, they kept telling me, why don't you come back? And I was like, no, this is my first time, visiting this town in Israel. And they were like, no, you have to come back. You have to return to Israel. And I was like, oh yeah. It's very much like the Zionist ideal, and it's wonderful. But it also means that there's not really a big incentive for a lot of Kurdish Jews in Israel, and probably, I'm sure, in the UK, the US, elsewhere, to want to go to the Kurdistan region. Life can be challenging. We have very limited electricity, so you have power cuts sometimes. There is conflict at the doorstep, but even at the worst steps, where there was war with the Islamic State, you never really had conflict inside the KR. So it's safe, but I think there's a combination of reasons why a lot of Kurdish Jews in general might not want to go back to the Kurdistan region.
I think there was a question for Dena, actually, but Fred Ezekiel, you didn't actually say what your question was. Perhaps you can write it in the chat. Yeah. Are there any more questions for Levi?
I'm not sure, should I maybe dive into the topic of Assyrians some more?
Yes, certainly. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry, my internet cut out, so I might have missed something.
No, go ahead. I think we heard you loud and clear.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the next thing that I really wanted to focus on was the idea of solidarity. So, I think a lot of us, we do have a lot of opportunities to do good things. I would say the most important thing is really to go to the Kurdistan region. You have a lot of people doing wonderful trips. Of course, Edwin has done a lot of trips. You've had some very Orthodox community members from Israel do trips, like Avi Goldstein, who had this famous video of him davening in a mosque next to a Kurdish Muslim who was on his prayer mat. And these very powerful images, which I think are only going to happen if people actually go to the Kurdistan region. So I hope that out of this talk, if anybody has any questions about that in particular, I'm more than happy to facilitate, honestly. And I'm just thrilled if anybody comes and makes the trip. I'm going to send a link to an article I wrote about Assyrians, and especially in relation to Al-Qush. Let me just take a look. Do you see much tourism in Kurdistan today? Yeah, there is, especially with the pandemic situation now lightening up. There's a lot of tourism. I've been getting quite a few messages, actually. Came from Kirkuk, went to Bombay. Yeah.
There's a question about extremist Muslims. Presumably the Kurds had enough of extremist Muslims when they fought against Daesh or ISIS. But how do they practice Islam? Are they, are they kind of moderate in their Islam, if one could describe it that way?
So the question I would respond with was, I would respond with actually the question, which is, are there extremist Christians in London? Are there extremist Muslims here?
It's a matter of degree, I think.
One of the most inspiring things which I've seen in London was actually I visited the Central Mosque, because I was curious, how does a community that's very hated by many people, how does it convey itself in these like very formal ways? And the Central Mosque was, I thought it was incredibly well done, how they communicate, how they convey themselves. So I would say that that same type of model would hopefully be possible in the Kurdistan region, because there are some people who are extremists, the same way that there are some Christians who are extremists in the UK, but it's more dynamic. Mm-hmm. It's much more dynamic, and I would say that a lot of the extremism is not, if you will, endogenous. I think a lot of it comes from porosity, maybe with Iran, or comes from porosity with kind of the conventional mindset of the Arab leadership. Mm-hmm. Are there many conversions to Islam? So at present, there are no conversions. I'm not sure if you're referring, Jacob, from Judaism or from Christianity. There are at present no Jews in the Kurdistan region. I mean, I consider myself an immigrant, if you will, but there's no Kurdish Jews remaining in the Kurdistan region. And that sounds like a very shocking statement to make, but when you talk to the National Association, talk to the Kurdish Jewish leadership, when they would leave a village and emigrate out, that was really it. There's nobody who has any ketubah or has any Jewish burial or has any anything that really conveys Jewish status. And from Christianity, I've heard of one Christian who converted to Islam, but it's not a big thing. Can you be openly Jewish instead of openly American? This is a very good question. So there's a difference between visiting and living. If you visit, go as you like. You know, there's really no restrictions for visiting. In terms of living, you know, having neighbors who know what time I leave the house every day, people who know my routine over the course of weeks and months and years. I prefer to be a bit discreet. I wear similar, actually I wear really the same type of head covering when I'm there, because it doesn't quite stand out as much. There is an Islamist political party in Kurdistan. There is, and actually, ironically, I got to know the family of the leadership, and it goes to show that even in this, you know, Islamist group, they're quite dynamic. Some more question about whether they speak Arabic or Aramaic. Yeah, true. The Jews from Kurdistan did speak Aramaic. I meant, where do you live, Levi? Oh, so I live in the Kurdistan region, but I'm outside right now. But I live in Erbil. I bought an apartment about 6 years ago. No. Yeah. So another thing I wanted to just sort of conclude on in terms of my official notes of things to cover is thawing of old boundaries. So a lot of these questions about extremism and Islamism and is it safe, a lot of these relate to actually this thing I wanted to touch on, which is boundaries. What boundaries exist? What is acceptable? And there are boundaries that remain, you know, like for example, Rudal and Kurdistan 24, when they published stories that, for example, like this Muslim, they published a story that this Muslim had like converted to Judaism and now is in control of the shrine of the prophet Nahum, which was totally wrong. Rather than retract that story, they decided to just essentially blacklist coverage of the Kurdish Jewish leadership in Israel. And that sounds shocking. It sounds like I'm leaving out something, but it's actually the truth. This was an executive decision made to blacklist coverage of Kurdish Jews in Israel in relation to the Kurdistan region. So I was stunned. So there are boundaries, and sometimes these boundaries pop up when you least expect them. But yeah, I've mentioned the word dynamic a lot, and you know, more and more people are experiencing the benefits of dynamism in the Kurdistan region. Are Kurds today generally aware of the historical Jewish presence? Absolutely. There's a extremely potent historical memory. You cannot go anywhere in Kurdistan without meeting Kurdish Muslims who will convey about the Jewish history of their area, their village, of specific buildings, or even of their own family. And it can be very sad sometimes because people will have this yearning for reconciliation, but there are other problems. They might also be very prone towards anti-Semitic stereotypes when you dive in deeper. I met one family that was celebrating Israel and they love Israel and they were talking all about Kurdish Jewishness, Jewish that, everything. And then I was like, they were on their computer and I saw that they were posting like Nazi themed posts. And I asked them, why are you posting like that you love Hitler? And they were saying, oh, he was good for Germany. And I was like, you know, this is the problem that happens when you have tolerance of a community that no longer exists there physically. Let's see, are there any other questions? You know, if somebody does have specific things they do want to ask, this is a perfect opportunity. I've tried to limit my own personal anecdotes to just convey a few key messages on the topography, if you will. We've lived together, but I'm going to know.
Can you tell us an anecdote or two? Yes.
So I would say probably one of the most striking, and I think it's one that might make people feel uncomfortable because it's a very reductive view of Jewishness. But there was one in particular. I visited a hotel in Dahuk, and I checked in, and the front desk was like looking at my name, and they were like, "Oh, is this a Hebrew name?" And I was like, "Yeah, it is." Yeah, and they pulled out a gigantic, like maybe I would say like a 6 foot, maybe it's like 2 meters, like a 2 meter flag of Israel, and they started waving it, and they were like, "Welcome." And I was like, I have no idea why they had this. I don't know, no idea what's going on, and I don't know if I feel comfortable with it, but thank you. I was very, I was very impressed. So yeah, Kurdistan region is a place that never stops surprising. It's an amazing region. I personally became involved more visibly because I felt that my life in the Kurdistan region personally depends on a future where Kurdish Jews have more freedom, there's reconciliation. But I feel that, of course, even without myself, that would still be the trend that's going to happen. There was a day center in Jerusalem with many Kurdish Jewish women. You know, it's wonderful. If you go to Jerusalem, there's something called Hakkari Street by the Kotel, and it's a Kurdish figure from, I believe, the Ayyubids, something like that. So there's a lot of Kurdish history, even in like ancient realm. And of course, the tomb of Queen Helena. She was from Erbil, and she became a very strong patriot. She was a convert. She was a Kurdish convert to Judaism, or you say proto-Kurdish convert to Judaism in Erbil, and she has a tomb in Jerusalem.
Mhm.
What is the name of the area in Israel where the Kurdish Jews live? There are many. There's quite a few communities in Israel.
Mhm.
So I spoke very quickly, but I invite, okay, I see a question. What brought me to Kurdistan? So I don't want to make it too much about myself. Someone asked what brought me to Kurdistan, but I felt like I had no choice. I visited when I was 19, and I fell in love with the place.
Mhm. And you've
And
got this foundation, Levi, foundation of hours. So
yes,
how does it work, and who's in it, and what is it supposed to achieve?
so I recently faced the obstacle that, you know, I live in Erbil. I have my day-to-day life. I have an intimate familiarity, if you will, with a lot of issues that are happening, but I had to formalize at the institutional level. And so I incorporated a religious nonprofit, or a synagogue, if you will, and I incorporated in the United States with a mission devoted to Jewish expression in the Kurdistan region. So I did this sort of out of a necessity, and also because I feel that it's very difficult to get things done sometimes unless you have like a letterhead, if you will. But it's been a blessing to be able to liaise between the Kurdish Jewish leadership in Israel and the government in the Kurdistan region. You know, I recognize that it may seem unusual to speak about these issues. As I've said, I'm not Kurdish, but it's been the greatest privilege in my life to be of service to not only a government, which I adore, the Kurdistan region, but also to a community that means a lot to me, and which I truly hope in the future will know more about and be able to comfortably visit their ancestral fatherland in Kurdistan. And, you know, it's very limited. You know, that does not include Iranian Kurdistan or areas in Turkey or Syria, but the Kurdistan region is a wonderful melting pot. Do you speak Hebrew and or Arabic? Um, I say I speak Hebrew as well as Malaysians can speak Arabic, which is just enough to pray. But I do speak some Arabic, just limited, but I speak more Kurdish.
Well, I think that's been absolutely fascinating. I think you probably want to get on with your road trip there, Levi. But we've been fascinated to listen to you. Thank you very much. And thank you to Dena for a wonderful exposition of the history. Thank you to all of you for being here. And I'd like to wish you all Chag Sameach, Pesach Sameach. We don't actually have a lockdown lecture next week, but please do join us in 2 weeks' time, unless there's somebody else who wants to say a final word before we close.
Edwin, would you like to speak?
No.
And just to say that, as you know, that I have a place in Erbil. You are all welcome to come and visit. I'll make kosher breakfast for you guys. It's on the 28th floor, and it's really a statement from me about the possibility of connection between the Jews of Kurdistan and the Jews of Babylon back to Iraq in good times, in 10, 20 years' time. But this is the statement that I made, and I stick by it. And I actually watch this space in the next 2 or 3 years. Think many things will be happening in that region, and I will be very happy to be part of it.
So there you are, 2 Jews in Erbil.
Right. And we also have a very special guest tonight who I've asked to speak, and that's Mo Bakhtiar, who is, I think, head of the Kurdish community in London, and he organised lots of events to celebrate or to commemorate the tragedy of Halabja. And would you like to speak, Mo?
Thank you. I am really impressed by what Levi said. I'm listening to the first speaker. I was born in Erbil, and I'm from Erbil. I'm a frequent visitor, and very grateful to what you have said about my people. As you can tell, the Pope's visit was a week ago, just over a week ago, tells you a lot that Kurds are tolerant by nature, tolerant to cultures, religion. And in the past 20, 30 years, we have learned a lot, and we have a big number of Kurds who live in the diaspora who learned a lot in coexisting and living with others, and they are making a big difference back home. So in the end, in the coming decades, we would like to have a community, London-like, Western-like, all other religions, cultures could coexist side by side and work together in loving and harmony. So I'm very impressive. If I came back to Erbil, I'll get in touch with Levi and hope to go for having kebab together.
That's lovely. And
Yeah,
Levi,
thank you very much.
Levi, do you want the last word? Because you've written something in the chat. Perhaps you would just say it.
So I want to just, truly convey that, despite my choices that I made to live in the Kurdistan region, and things which I've been very, very, very honored to experience and be a part of, and people to meet, from Edwin to you to Mr. Bakhtiar to Dr. Zakin, wonderful people. I feel that my presence, if you will, even in this time slot, is in a way, it shouldn't be the way the world is. There should be a world where there are Kurdish Jews living in the Kurdistan region part-time, visiting back and forth more regularly. So I hope that you enjoy this experience, because hopefully in the years ahead, there'd be someone truly be able to speak to it, because I'll have a connection to it as their fatherland. And in the meantime, I hope I could convey some of the major key points. And if anything stands out, I encourage everybody, please come to Erbil, and I'm more than happy to also answer any questions as well. So.
Okay, that's wonderful. Well, we have our man in Erbil. Well, actually, we have 2 men in Erbil.
Right. Well, can we wish everyone a happy Pesach?
Yes.
And what I'm going to do is what we always do. We allow everyone to unmute and say hello to each other. So I'm going to unmute everyone now, or give people the right to ability to unmute themselves. So everyone can now unmute themselves.
Chag Sameach from Jerusalem, Lynn.
Thank you, Ariel. Thank you, and to you too. And to you too.
Pleasure to.
Thank you to the speakers.
Thank you very much.
Can I ask a question of Dena?
Can I
you.
ask a
Yes,
question?
of course you
Dina?
can ask
Someone has
Dina.
an echo on. Someone has more than one speaker on. Can they ask the person with more than one speaker on to turn it
It
off?
was a
Yes. What was your
It was a
question to Dina?
fascinating talk.
Oh.
It was a fascinating talk, and it's amazing. I'd never thought that anybody still lived there, let alone visit them. You know, there seems those remote places, and yet you bring everybody so close to each other. It's amazing. I thought Egypt and the Middle East was predominantly Jewish. I didn't know that we had families. Sing amazing talk, and how you run it. It's amazing. It's fascinating.
Well, I'm so glad that you came.
And I didn't have to go to bed.
I'm glad it is.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm sure everybody else did. Look forward to the next one.
Yes,
Lynn.
thank you very much. We go to Burma from Kurdistan.
Oh, lovely. Oh, lovely. Well, that's a lovely trip.
You don't have to worry about the travel ban.
No, you don't.
Or COVID, when you have
Exactly.
it's amazing. Literally.
I just want to say a few words to Levi. Kol hakavod. Obviously, you did amazing, and we'll follow you in Arbil. Just an anecdotal thing. You know, the Iraqi Jews around at Pesach Seder will sing. Well, they'll sing the whole Haggadah, but they will sing Helach Ma'anya both in Aramaic and in the Judeo-Arabic. So if you get a tape before Saturday night, you might, if you're going to be in Arbil, I think it will be appropriate for you. Otherwise, we'll teach it for you for next year. It's back the 1,000 years that people sang it there. Since we're not there, you are our ambassador.
Well,
I hope I'm not confusing you. Right.
No, that's wonderful. And I do want to note that, you know, especially on religious issues, I've tried to internalize the significance of always conveying respect to the community for whom the Kurdistan region is a fatherland. So growing up from a very American household, it's been an incredible journey of education, and it's been able to also reconnect me a lot with my own personal faith. So quite a journey.
Good luck. Good luck. Yeah. Good luck to you. Okay.
How
Thank you
do we
again.
get in touch
And
with
thank
Levi?
you, Julian.
Yeah.
How do we get in touch with Levi?
I can put you in touch.
Okay,
Thank
that's
you.
perfect.
Yeah,
And
if you're happy to be in touch. Yeah.
And I'm totally happy to be available by iMessage, WhatsApp.
All right, I can
email.
vouch for Odette. She's my cousin.
I'll send you the song. I'll send you the song that Odette mentioned about Helach Ma'anya, the Aramaic song. I'll send it to you on WhatsApp as soon as Lynn sends it to me.
We've got it here.
Yeah, but and then in Judeo-Arabic they say it.
هذا خبز المسكين.
Yeah, that's Arabic. That's Arabic.
Of course.
May I add a comment, please?
Yes,
Sami wants to say something, Lynn.
Yes, say something.
I haven't got that on mine, darling.
I just want to say,
Ignore it.
hello.
Just don't touch it. Don't touch it.
I just want to say that the Jews of Mosul lived in a ghetto, which is something strange. They were not allowed to have a cemetery. They buried their dead around their houses or in their basement.
Yes, I heard.
Is Mrs. Attar aware of that?
Dina, did you know that? Where are you?
No, I hadn't heard that. I did hear that there were graves that were underneath somewhere else. That there was a graveyard that something had been built over it. I think the very old quarter. It was very old quarter inside the city walls, and you were not allowed, and the graves had to be outside the city walls. So I think it obviously became a big problem when the city expanded and there was no more room.
Lena, can I ask a question, please?
Yeah.
May I add a few things, please?
Yes. Go on. Just add a couple of things.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I was in Mosul in 1938. My father took us to visit, and we were in the main street, not far away from the British consulate. When the consul came out to talk, they attacked him, and my father carried my brother and myself, and we ran away. We stayed 2-3 days in the house. We didn't leave, and we heard that the council was beaten in such a way that nothing of the body is left. It was very, very vicious kind of attack.
You're still on the same zone?
Yes, we still are. I've got a good view of the back of your head.
Can I ask Lena a question, please?
Yes, please go ahead, Freddie.
Listen, first let me tell you, I want to thank you very much. You filled a lot of holes in my experience. I was born in Baghdad, but my great-grandfather traveled from Kirkuk to Bombay. Now, the people in Kirkuk, you said, spoke Aramaic, but he did not speak, I don't think, Aramaic. They spoke Arabic. And transferred all the culture to Bombay, a big Jewish community from there. Can you help me, tell me a little more about the Jewish communities, this difference between Mosul and Kirkuk? They were not in Mosul, they were in Kirkuk.
Yeah. I don't know. I have to say I don't know very much about Kirkuk, but I think there are some very detailed accounts by travelers in the 19th century and early 20th century, which detail what languages were spoken where. And I think you would probably find that in the larger towns where people had more interactions with other communities, they'll be less likely to speak Aramaic and more likely to speak Arabic, because it depends who you're working with. But so I think the Aramaic is spoken more in the smaller places. That's my understanding of it anyway. But certainly, I mean, people did travel a lot. So I think when we talk about which languages people speak, we sometimes assume that, you know, like many of us, like people like me, for example, you really only speak one language fluently. But that's not true for everyone in the world. Many people actually had to use more than one language in their daily lives. And they were well used to that. They were well used to switching from one language to another, depending who they were with.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I was wondering, was anybody in Kurdistan speak Ladino?
I shouldn't think so.
Why Arabic and not Ladino?
Yeah.
If they come from the Middle East, it would be Ladino, wouldn't it?
No, Spain.
No, I tell you
Because
what, we know.
whenever in Spain, they went from the first temple, before the first temple. So they never.
Right, the Assyrian exile. Yeah.
There were Jews in exile from Palestine during the other wars. So that before even the Ladinos started, before the Sephardim from Spain started. So are they Sephardi, Ashkenaz, or Mizrahim?
Oh, that's a big question, Ninette. I'm not sure we can answer it tonight.
They are Jews from Kurdistan.
Can I say something?
They're Assyrian.
No more.
It's so fascinating, and we have so many traditions that we should put something down. Like, for example, the Manishtana that you said, my father, the whole of the Haggadah, we used to say it in Ladino, but the Manishtana, he said it in Aramaic.
Yeah, but that's universal.
And I couldn't understand it, and we didn't understand it at all. And then he had to translate it into either Spanish, French, or whatever language. We had some visitors staying in our house for Seder night. So he did it traditionally. And then if we had British soldiers in, we'd say it in English. if we had French visitors or anybody like that, we put the French in it. But it was an amazing Haggadah. And we started at 6 o'clock, finished at midnight before we sat for our first meal. And it was fascinating. It's amazing. I remember Pesach is the best festival because you have tradition and you have things that you did with your family. The other things, you go to shul and you have other things. But Pesach is a family festival where you are together with your children, grandchildren, relatives, friends, and everybody has memories of Pesach.
That's lovely.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. It's wonderful to hear you, Ninette.
It's lovely.
I just wondered, Lily Shaw, was the gentleman from the Assyrian organization in Israel, was he on the call or not?
Oh, Dr. Yaakov Maoz, yes, I don't think I didn't.
He didn't come. No, he made his point and then he left. No, there was the gentleman. Yeah,
I wanted to comment.
Yes, who objected
about the Ladino.
Yes,
there were Jews who came to Babylon, Iraq in the 19th century from Salonika, from other parts who they spoke Ladino, but I don't think that actually the Sassoon family also, their roots are from Spain, Spanish community,
Same family.
and but I don't think that they spoke the Ladino.
No, or they probably lost it quite soon because they were a minority in an Arabic-speaking majority.
But there are families who came from Saloniki, to Kirkuk also, and to other places, but I don't think that they spoke Ladino.
Very interesting.
Well, my family comes from a very long tradition. They came from Spain and traveled, and my grandmother was born in Italy, and my family are the Casuto rabbinical family, and he was invited by the Jewish community in Turkey to be the rabbi in Turkey, and my mother was born in Turkey, and my grandfather came from these, and then he went to Egypt. Being kicked out of every country, in other words. That's how
I think there was a question. Sorry, Nina, just to say that. Nina, do you know more about the Sassoon synagogue in Mosul? Can you enlighten us about that?
I think it was built in the late 19th century. It was much the largest.
Yeah.
There are some lovely photographs of it in Ezra Laniado's book. I don't think he says anything about who donated the funds, but I think it's very likely that the Sassoon family donated. I can check, actually. I would have to go back and look up if there's any more information that I can find about it. Because it may be that it wasn't actually built until the early 20th century. That's quite possible. They did more synagogues in the 20th century. As the community grew, they needed more. I just want to go back to what was the question about Ladino and where people came from. Ezra Laniado himself was from a family that had come to Mosul from Aleppo, and although he wrote this fantastic history of the Jews of Mosul, the Laniado family themselves weren't even considered to be proper Maslawis by some other members of the Mosul community, because they're
imposters from Aleppo.
Relatively new arrivals, and actually they were given the surname Halabi for a while, meaning they were from Aleppo. But of course, they'd come from Aleppo from somewhere else, and there are other branches of the Laniado family which I think they were famous rabbis in Syria and in Jerusalem, and I think their origins were in Italy.
Lynn, if I can add a word, usually in Chutz La'aretz, not like in Israel, we have 2 days.
Yes.
So the first day, people who are also very tired, they make in Hebrew, the Haggadah, or in Aramaic. But the second days, my family come to Morocco from Spain. From Morocco, go to Spain and come back. And on the second day of Pesach, my father was translating the Haggadah in Hiketia, you know, in
right,
Spanish.
which is Moroccan Spanish.
This was for
Moroccan
the
Spanish.
second days. Others do it in Arabic.
Yes.
Others make also in Berberic. Also, they were translating
Berber.
Berberic. Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. I'm very. Yeah.
How interesting. Yeah, everybody, each day.
It was a very big pleasure for me to hear about Kurdistan, because one time I was in the Israeli museum and I heard Madricha, you know, a tourist guide, saying that Abraham Avinu was born there, not in Ur, like it is near Basra, but Ur in the Kurdistan. And my rabbi was from Algeria. You know, he know what is a map, because he was an officer rabbi in the French army. And she says that Abraham was in Galut. He was the family, he was born there, but the family was from another place. But all our history began in this place, Zahu and all this place. So for me, it's very fantastic to hear about Irbid and the Kurdistan, and it's part of me. Like, it's fantastic. Thank you very much.
It's lovely. It's fascinating.
We have to be also in contact with Monsieur Levi. Yes.
No, you better call it a day and get on with making the almond macaroon.